She was named for a princess, you know, from one of William Shakespeare's work, no less. Princess Florizel. Now all of Bowring's fleet were named like that. Kind of pompous, if you ask me. But nobody asked me. I was only a lowly table boy, waiter, part-time cook. Sort of jack of all trades, I suppose you could call me. But I knew everything that happened on that ship. I drank and played cards with the boys in steerage. And I ran messages up to the first-class passengers in the staterooms. But nobody asked me. I heard stories whispered, so nobody could hear. And words shouted in anger, regardless of who could hear. So I'll tell you what I think. What every sailor worth his salt thought at the time. Now Sir Eric Bowring might tell you something different than what Fred Roberts is telling you. Our Florizel is a massive ship, 300 luxurious feet, reinforced hull to break the ice, 4 decks of staterooms for the merchants and professionals, splendidly furnished in oak and mahogany, richly carpeted and upholstered in plush green tapestry, a grand piano, and an even grander staircase. Pure luxury. She served her country, carrying the first 500 overseas, and served the commoners well at the sealing front. What he didn't tell you is that the sealers didn't quite experience the 300 luxurious feet. They were banned from the salons and the staterooms. The elegant floors were covered in rough lumber to protect them from the sealers' hobnail boots. And the sealers had to sleep down in the hold, on top of the seal pelts. But I suppose that was just the times we were living in. Now, hindsight's a funny thing. The wife always says hindsight is something you get from changing too many diapers. She never believed in it. But when people look back to when the Florizel was leaving St. John's, they could never forget the screeching sound of the ship's horns. Something awful was going to happen to the Florizel. Now, when there's a tragedy like this, some people say, well, 'twas fate. But you can't blame fate for this one. Fate did everything it could to keep the Florizel in St. John's that night. There was an outbreak of smallpox between the kitchen and serving crew. And she was quarantined in the harbour for 2 or 3 days. And people had to be cleared before they got off. And it cost $5,000 to fumigate her. Massive sum in those days. But Bowring's paid it, and she sailed, not far behind schedule. Now, you got to think about God at a time like this. People cancelled their trips because they were afraid of smallpox. So smallpox, the deadliest of diseases, saved them. And a contingent of 60 soldiers in training for the war overseas were scratched from the trip, and they lived to go down the war. So the Florizel certainly had her history, and not all of it good. She carried the sealers to the front for the Great Slaughter. And she carried the first 500 overseas to their slaughter. So when she settled on Horn Head on February 24th, 1918, well, that's when her last 94 were slaughtered. But you can't blame the Florizel for that. She did her job. She would have got them through. 'Twas men made all the mistakes. And Philip Jackman from her news said as much before he died. It was only 57 miles from Cape Spear to Cape Race. A man could walk it in 10 or 11 hours. And there was only 3 lights to keep you on course. Babel's Head, Freyland Head, and Burnt Cove. 3 lights to guide you through the graveyard of the Atlantic. So yes, I was scared. worried about the ice and the high winds. I was only 31 years old, for God's sakes. Third officer to Captain William Martin, experienced, cautious skipper. And John Reeder, the Scotsman, was the chief engineer. 25 years with the Red Cross line, 8 years on the Florizel, and he ruled the engine room with absolute power. And any sailor will tell you, oil and water don't mix. So Captain Martin and Chief Reeder didn't step on each other's toes. Now, the skipper set a course southwest for 5 or 6 hours at 11 knots, and then he'd holler west for Halifax. Now, afterwards, people said that this was a fair weather course, that we should have been further offshore. But Captain Martin had sailed the Florizel in the worst kind of weather. As a matter of fact, he was one of the very few Newfoundland skippers at the time who hadn't lost a ship or a crew member. He knew what he was doing. But right out of St. John's, I knew we weren't doing 11 knots. And Captain Joseph Kane, famous for his trips to the ice, allowed maybe 7 knots. And I had a suspicion of why Chief Reeder might have her slowed in. It was something he taught me in confidence. And may God forgive me, I kept it to myself. Now the skipper, he had his own doubts, but he gave the orders for 11 knots. And Chief Reeder never told him any difference. So he had to be doing 11 knots. So when Captain Martin gave the order to holler to the west 9 hours after we left St. John's, in his mind, we were well beyond Cape Race. He never could have believed he was sailing her full steam up onto the rocks at Horn Head. There were bodies washing around on the deck everywhere, some half naked, one lady with a full-length fur coat. And passengers were scrambling up out of the staterooms so they wouldn't be drowned. And they lined up to a door at the top of the staircase, and in their turn stepped out and got swept away. The privileged and the poor ended up side by side, hanging on to the ship's railing, while the powerful seas tried to pound them off the deck. And the poor bastard, with not a pot to piss in, fought just as hard as the fellow next to him, hanging on to a suitcase full of money. And poor little Betty Munn, just 3 years old, washed out to sea. Now what can you say about that? The seas were unbelievably vicious. The winds were indiscriminate. Now that's a big word for me to know. But I had to learn it. I had to find a way to describe what I saw. A wave, the height of the smokestack, came crashing in, and as on its way out, took whatever it wanted. Tubs of fish, lifeboats, grand pianos, and people. And then it came roaring in again, and threw back what it didn't want. Herb Taylor, 3 times. He said it was like a giant dragon's tongue, sucking him out from behind safety. 3 times. Now don't tell me he wasn't meant to live. Hour after grueling hour, the seas pounded on us. And the only thing that kept all hands from being lost was people looking out for each other. Grabbing someone by the hair of the head so they wouldn't be carried away. Pushing the lady ahead of you into safety because she lost her glasses and she couldn't see. Tearing the clothes off a dead body, trying to save the few that were still left alive. For 27 hours. Huddled in the little Marconi shack, tacked onto the deck, ahead of the smokestack. And the same vicious onshore winds kept the local fishermen and their dories on the beach all this time. 2 or 3 of them were nearly lost, trying to get a lifeline to us, because it wasn't in their nature to stand by and do nothing. The Chidleys and the Quinns and the Canes and the McCarthys and the Jackmans and many others passed on stories to their families about being there and searching for bodies and carrying the dead to the railway so their families could have some peace. But you didn't read very much about that in the newspapers or in the books. And a few winter supplies washed up for weeks after. And there were rumours about strong boxes being thrown in by the waves and a few coins rolling up on the beach. And one day, while Arthur Jackman was out walking, little Betty Munn's doll washed ashore. And he gave it to his youngest daughter, Mary. And a doll was like gold to a child in those days. But a couple of years later, she passed it on to her cousin, Katie Foley, who was feeling poorly. And the doll brought such joy to Katie. And out in Bowring Park, there's a statue of Peter Pan, erected in memory of little Betty Munn. And there's a plaque on the statue that reminds everybody about the tragedy. Perhaps that's all I'm trying to do. Remind everyone. Now we all knew Chief Reader slowed the engine in because he wanted to spend the night with his family in Halifax. They'd been devastated by the great explosion in Halifax Harbour, and he wanted to spend some time with them. Who could blame him? But a lot of people did. But not us. Not his shipmates. He lost his life. That was enough punishment. The last time I saw the Florizel was from the top of a giant wave. Two brave oarsmen from the Prospero or the Hull or the Hawk bringing the last of us out to safety. And I could still see the Marconi shack tacked on to the deck. It was built to hold 2 or 3 people, and it wrapped its arms around 32 of us, and we wrapped our arms around each other for 27 hours. And we only let go long enough to push some poor old dead soul out through the door and haul in somebody else who was still alive. For 27 hours. And the great irony of this is that poor communications had put us up on the Horn Head. And here we were in a little room surrounded by the latest and the greatest in communication technology. And we were left to communicate with God. And I'll take this memory to my grave. We were all huddled there, freezing to death, with not a chance of rescue in sight. And William Malloy from Cape Royal, almost dead, spoke up. And he said, I'm going to tell you what. We don't have very much. And we might not have done a whole lot in our lives for people to remember us by. But you mark my words, they'll be talking about us 100 years from now. Thank you very much.